The widow came to Las Animas Ranch carrying an empty flour sack folded under her arm so no one would see what it meant. Nora Weller had eaten the last heel of bread the night before. At sunrise, she had sold her husband's good coat to pay the room she owed in town. By noon, dust had turned the hem of her brown dress the color of ash, and 20 men in the branding pen had already decided why a woman walked alone toward a cattle ranch. She let them decide. She had stopped correcting strangers months ago. It cost too much and changed nothing. At the rail, a red steer twisted under a dragging rope. One rider hauled harder, frightening the animal into the fence rail with a crack loud enough to make the whole pen flinch. Nora dropped her sack. "Slack the heel rope," she called, climbing the lower rail without asking permission from anyone. "He cannot step where you've tied his foot." The rider swore at her. The ranch owner did not. Caleb Rourke stood inside the pen, dust in his black hair, a fresh tear opening at his shirt sleeve. He looked at the steer, then at her. "You know cattle. I know what panic costs." She didn't look away from the animal. "Everyone in this pen is teaching that steer to be more afraid, not less." He studied her a moment longer than the sentence required. Then he ordered the rope slacked. The steer found its footing. The struggle ended before it became a broken leg. Only then did Nora climb down and retrieve her sack. "I need work," she said. "Not charity. Work, wages, and supper earned before dark." His foreman laughed once, short and ugly. Caleb didn't. His eyes had already gone to the flour sack she'd tried to keep hidden against her side. "The cook left yesterday," he said. Something in Nora's face closed like a door. "Then hire a cook." "That's not what I asked." He tipped his head toward the yard behind him, cattle milling at a dry trough, hay stacked with no rain cover, 2 men arguing over a tally board while a loaded wagon waited. "What work are you asking for?" Nora looked at all of it, really looked, the way she'd once looked at her own dying homestead and refused to stop counting even when counting hurt. "The work no one here is doing," she said. "Keeping waste from eating your ranch alive." He should have sent her away. A woman with an empty flour sack and no letters of reference was, by every sensible measure, a risk not worth taking. Instead, he asked the question that changed both their lives. "What would you count first?" Nora counted water before she counted cattle. Water always came first, a habit from a dry year that had taught her the hardest way possible. Las Animas ran along a narrow New Mexico river, cottonwoods marking the only reliable green for miles. Nearly 900 head, 30 saddle horses, a bunkhouse, 2 tenant cottages, a leased hay meadow upstream. From the road it looked prosperous. Up close it was bleeding from 100 small cuts nobody had bothered to name. By dusk she'd found 40 sacks of oats logged as 52, 6 of them ruined under torn canvas, and a wagon charged twice by the same freighter. She laid her findings on the harness room bench without accusing a soul. Caleb studied the marks a long time before he spoke. 7 days, he said. $1 a day, meals, the small room behind the wash house. $1.25 if I'm keeping the accounts and doing inventory both. His foreman, Wade Barlow, made a sound low in his throat. "Our riders earn less than that." "Your riders aren't being asked to find out where their wages went," Nora said, and didn't blink. Something close to a smile moved across Caleb's mouth and thought better of itself. $1.25. 7 days. Paid each evening. The room locks from the inside. My letters are mine. If you dismiss me, I keep what I've earned and you put me on the next wagon to town. Wade looked at her like hunger had made her insolent. Caleb wrote the terms into the ranch daybook and signed beneath them. Nora read every line before she added her own name. Some habits once beaten into a person by hard winters never soften. That evening she ate beef stew slower than her body wanted, from a bowl chipped blue at the rim. It matched, almost exactly, a pair her late husband Daniel had bought them years before, back when a matched pair of bowls had seemed like the start of something instead of the whole of it. One had cracked during his final fever. She'd left the other behind in her town room. Carrying it here had felt too much like asking a dead man to keep feeding her. Caleb noticed the pause. He didn't ask about it. He only pushed the bread within her reach and talked instead about the ranch, how his brother Micah had once run the stores and the crews and the arguments, until a spring horse wreck in the lower pasture took him in a single bad fall no one had seen coming. Since then, Caleb had carried every decision alone, dawn to dark, and told no one how much it weighed. How long until the beef contract pays? Nora asked. 6 weeks if the buyer takes the full lot. And if he doesn't? Caleb looked toward the dark window instead of answering right away. Then winter chooses what I sell. She understood that sentence better than she wanted to. The next day she moved through the ranch like a woman reading a language everyone else had stopped noticing was there. She measured the leaking cistern with a marked broom handle. She asked the stable boy, Tomas, how much water he hauled by hand. 2 hours a day, it turned out, lost to a crack nobody had patched. She asked the cook's helper, Pearl, how flour was measured, and learned that hungry riders simply helped themselves after dark. She asked Wade for cattle counts and got 3 different numbers from 3 different mouths. By the 4th night, her slate didn't show one large loss. It showed 50 small ones, bleeding the ranch dry a spoonful at a time. Caleb found her near midnight at the long kitchen table, moving dried beans from one cup to another to work out a feed ratio in the lamplight. You're paid for daylight, he said. I couldn't sleep. That's not the same as owing me darkness. He closed her notebook gently, the way a man closes a door he doesn't want to slam. Work tomorrow. She resented him a little for seeing the habit she'd hidden even from herself, that if she stayed useful every waking hour, no one could call her a burden. It was an old fear with an old shape, and he'd found it in 4 days. At her door, he handed her a small brass key. Only one? She asked. Only yours. The spare's on the sill inside. It was a small thing. It was also the first promise anyone had kept to her without being asked twice, and she noticed that, the way a person notices the first warm day after a hard freeze, almost afraid to trust it. On the 7th day, Nora had saved the ranch enough grain to cover 3 weeks of her own wages twice over. She hadn't performed a miracle. She'd issued scoops of a fixed size, moved sacks onto wood runners off the damp floor, required a mark for every withdrawal, and talked Pearl into baking a late loaf before the night riders could raid the flour bin. Tomas had patched the cistern with oakum and pitch once Nora showed Caleb what 2 lost hours a day actually cost in wages. At sunset, Caleb placed $9.75 into her palm. I want another month, he said. Stores, accounts, schedules. Those are 3 jobs. Then name the position. Nora glanced through the open harness room door. Wade was listening. 2 riders had stopped pretending to oil tack. Ranch clerk with authority over stores, she said. I'll advise on schedules. I don't command riders unless you say so in front of the crew. $2 a day. $2 a separate meal allowance when ranch business sends me to town. Sunday afternoons free and written notice before dismissal except for theft or violence. Caleb leaned back against the bench, something almost amused in his face. You bargain like a woman with another offer waiting. I bargain like a woman who's lived without one. She kept her voice even. It cost her something to keep it that way. The room went quiet. Caleb wrote the terms himself and added a line no one asked for, that her notebooks and personal papers belonged to her alone, though the ranch day book stayed ranch property. Then he called the crew together. Mrs. Weller controls the storeroom and its counts, he said. If she asks where something went, answer her. If you dispute a count, bring the item or a witness. Don't bring me your dislike of being counted. Wade's jaw tightened. And schedules. She recommends. I decide, he said it plainly, no apology in it, and Nora was glad of that. Borrowed authority dressed up as equality would have cost her more than an honest limit ever could. Her first recommendation made nearly everyone unhappy. She split water hauling and fence work into rotating crews, instead of letting Wade reward his favorites with easier horse work. And she put Caleb himself on the cistern crew for half a morning. Owners don't haul water, he said, one eyebrow raised. Owners generally aren't fond of being ordered around by clerks. You recommended. Very carefully. That earned her a real smile, quick, almost startled out of him, before he picked up a trowel and got to work beside her. They knelt at the stone lip together, pitch warming under his hands, the leak's exact source marked by hers. When her wrist tired, he reached for the bucket, then stopped himself mid-motion. May I? It was an ordinary question. Her answer should have been just as ordinary. But in the last desperate year of her marriage, Daniel had often simply taken the tool from her hands, her mistakes frightening him past patience. Caleb waited instead, as if her saying no wouldn't cost him anything at all. Yes, she said, and meant more by it than the bucket. By noon, the water line held. That small victory only made the next problem more visible. The upstream hay meadow had yielded far less than expected, and when Nora set the lease receipts beside the wagon loads, the shortfall was large enough to matter come January. Wade blamed the tenant families for feeding their milk cows off ranch stacks. Pearl blamed loose tarps and mold. Caleb blamed himself quietly for not riding up to check sooner. Nora didn't yet know who to blame. She only knew the numbers: feed enough for a mild winter, debt enough for a hard one. That night, in her own notebook, she wrote, "Every promise costs something. Count before promising." Beneath it, after a long pause with the pen hovering, she added a second line: "Do not mistake being paid for being safe." Respect arrived unevenly, the way it always does. Pearl came around first, once the new flour measure ended the whispered accusations against her kitchen. Tomas followed when Nora carved out half a day each week for him to learn wagon repair from the blacksmith instead of losing every hour to the cistern. The riders held out longest, until a cold rain caught the north herd, and Nora's supply list had already put dry socks, coffee, and spare rope on the wagon before Wade even thought to ask for them. Caleb said nothing when the men rode back warm. He simply hung Nora's list beside the tally board, her name written plain at the bottom. Wade tore it down the next morning. Nora found it folded under the ink bottle and carried it out to the yard, where Caleb and Wade were sorting remounts. Was the list wrong, she asked. Wade kept his eyes on a bay gelding. Men don't need a widow's name hanging over their heads to know their own business. Caleb said nothing, waiting to see what she'd do with it. "No," Nora said. "But the ranch needs to remember whose work kept it from a loss. Yours included, Wade." She unfolded the sheet. Beside each item she'd written who had reported the need: Wade for rope, Pearl for coffee, Tomas for canvas. A record isn't a throne. It's memory that can't flatter its friends. Wade's face colored. Caleb rehung the list without a word, and it stayed. What changed after that surprised her. Men started bringing her broken tool counts, cattle numbers, even complaints. Not because they liked her, necessarily, but because they'd started to trust the ledger more than their own memory. Through it, she learned Wade wasn't stealing hay at all. He'd quietly let 3 tenant families keep extra feed after 2 of their milk cows calved late, families who depended on that milk to feed children through the cold months. He'd hidden it because Caleb's rule allowed no private animals at ranch expense, and he hadn't known how else to keep a promise that predated the rule. "You should dismiss him," Nora told Caleb that night in the empty kitchen. Caleb stood at the table, both hands braced beside the chipped blue bowl. "For feeding children. For altering the stores and hiding it. You sound very certain." Certainty is cheaper before winter than after. Something shifted in his face, grief wearing the mask of irritation. Micah used to say mercy was easiest with someone else's hay. Nora heard what lived underneath that. Was he wrong? He wasn't a careless man. Caleb's voice roughened. He was thrown from a green horse in the lower pasture, working cattle none of us thought were dangerous. It happened in under a minute. I've spent 8 months trying to find a decision in it I could have stopped. And there isn't one. That's the part I can't forgive. Not him. The fact that there's nothing to blame. Nora didn't offer comfort too quickly. She'd learned from her own grief how cheap quick comfort could feel. Caleb didn't dismiss Wade. Instead, he required the milk cow feed to be logged openly and gave the tenant families a choice: repay it through winter labor or take a reduced cash share after the army sale. All 3 chose labor. Nora believed, privately, that he'd weakened the only rule protecting the stores. Caleb believed she was trying to make the numbers innocent by refusing to see the people living underneath them. They worked poorly together for 2 days after that, polite, correct, and cold. Then Caleb rode up to the meadow himself and came back with an answer neither of them had expected. Grasshoppers, not greed, had stripped the far end before the cutting. Wade had known and had said nothing, because Micah, before the accident, had promised the tenant families their milk cows would be protected through one hard winter, and Wade had been quietly keeping a dead man's word without telling the living one who'd have to pay for it. That evening, Caleb set a small red memorandum book in front of her. "Micah's," he said. "Read it. If you're going to count my ranch, you should know what it already owes." Giving it to her cost him. She could see that in the way his thumb lingered on the worn leather before he let go. Inside were feed estimates, names, small kindnesses recorded in a cramped, hurried hand. On the last written page, A ranch is cattle, land, and the people who remain when either one fails. Nora closed the book and sat with it a long moment. For the first time since Daniel died, she found herself wishing someone would still be in the room after the work was finally done. The army buyer arrived 3 weeks early, and drought had made him unsentimental. Captain Bell walked the contract steers with a surgeon's eye, rejected the leanest third outright, and cut his price on the rest. The loss was enough to unravel Caleb's whole winter plan in a single afternoon. Nora asked for 1 hour before he signed anything. In the office, she laid out the herd tallies, hay estimates, payroll, and the banknotes side by side the way she'd once laid out her own family's last dwindling accounts, back when there was still time to change the ending. "Sell only what he'll take," she said, "and we cover the bank and December wages, but not winter feed. Sell breeding cows instead, and we keep cash but lose next spring's calves. Hold everything, and we gamble the whole herd on a mild January." Captain Bell glanced at her figures, then at Caleb. "Your clerk?" "My operations manager," Caleb said before he'd thought it through. Nora's eyes cut to him. They had never once discussed that title. Bell didn't care about the surprise on either of their faces. He cared that she could sort animals by weight, age, and likely winter loss faster than his own quartermaster. She proposed a second lot, older cull cows for the fort's fresh beef schedule, delivered in stages, so Las Animas could hold them on poor pasture until needed rather than losing them all at once. Lower price. Lighter burden. Bell agreed to inspect the cows. Nora should have felt something like triumph. Instead, she watched Caleb take his hat off as the first animals passed the gate. Cows carrying his father's bloodline, sold by the pound because her arithmetic had made the sacrifice plain and unavoidable. "You can refuse," she told him quietly. "Can the ranch afford refusal?" "No." "Then don't offer me a gentler lie than that." The words landed harder than he could have known. Daniel had said almost exactly that to her once, during their own last dry season, after she'd sold her mother's silver to buy seed, and warned him the rains looked too uncertain to plant it all, and he'd planted it all anyway. When the crop failed, he'd apologized until the fever took what was left of his strength. Apology hadn't brought back the silver or the crop or him. That night in the barn aisle, with an old cow breathing warm and slow between them, she told Caleb the whole of it for the first time. "I didn't lose Daniel because he ignored me," she said. "I know that's true. But some part of me still keeps an account against a dead man because anger is so much easier to carry than grief." Caleb rested his forearms on the stall door, not looking at her, which somehow made it easier for both of them. "I keep Micah's promises because if I question even one of them, I might have to ask why he took that ride at all, and I'm not ready for what the answer might be." Neither of them rushed to comfort the other. They simply stood there long enough for the silence to become its own kind of company. "The manager's title wasn't mine to give without terms," Caleb said finally. "No, I wanted Bell to listen to you." "He did. That doesn't make it right." The next morning he made it right in the daybook, 14 days as acting operations manager, subject to her written acceptance, with the crew keeping the right to bring disputes straight to him. Her wage rose to $3 a day. Nora accepted with one condition of her own. Every emergency order she gave would be reviewed with him before supper, no decision made in the dark that couldn't survive daylight. Their first real success cost them 47 cows and cost Caleb something harder to count, his certainty that keeping every inherited thing was the same as loyalty. It changed something quieter, too. He began waiting to plan the next day's work until he saw her lamp lit in the office. She began setting aside the one unchipped bowl for him without quite admitting to herself why. When he rode to the fort for 2 days, the ranch ran smoothly without him. Nora slept badly anyway. She told herself she didn't need him to come back. She knew, lying awake, that she wanted to hear his boots outside the office door. By October, Nora was running Las Animas in every way that could be measured, though the ledger still refused to turn cheerful. She'd staggered the grazing, locked the reserve hay behind a rule requiring 2 names in the book before it could be touched, moved every repair ahead of the cold, and built a working council of 4, Wade for cattle, Pearl for food stores, Tomas for wagons and water, herself for allocation. Caleb kept ownership and final responsibility, but he'd stopped mistaking final responsibility for the right to carry every decision alone. The hay in an ordinary year would last through February. A hard winter starting early would leave them short, and the only large reserve outside the ranch herd itself belonged to the tenant families, the very cows Micah had promised to protect. Nora favored selling weak stock early, while prices still held. Caleb favored waiting to see what the weather actually brought. Waiting is a wager, she said. Selling now is surrender. To weather. Not to an enemy. The cows we sell can't calve in the spring. Dead cows can't either. Their arguments had begun to have the shape of habit rather than anger, familiar grooves worn smooth by use. Caleb had learned when she needed facts and when she needed silence. Nora had learned that his long pauses weren't refusal. He simply thought in the slow rhythm of land and animals, not words. One evening, a north wind slammed the office shutter loose. Caleb reached across her to catch the latch and stopped, his hand hovering near her shoulder. "May I?" She nodded, and he fastened it. Neither of them moved right away afterward. His sleeve brushed hers. The room smelled of ink, cold iron, and pinon smoke, and for a moment the wind outside seemed very far away. "Nora," he said, just her name, but she heard the whole question folded inside it. "Not while I live in your room and draw your wages," she answered gently before he could finish asking. He stepped back at once. Something crossed his face. Not anger, just a clean, honest disappointment he didn't try to hide. "Then I won't ask again under those terms." By morning, he'd turned that disappointment into something useful instead of sulking over it. He laid out real alternatives: a spare room with the schoolteacher, Mrs. Ortega in town with the supply wagon twice a week, or the washhouse room kept on, formally deducted from her wages at the same low rate charged to the two married hands, with no power on his part to remove her except through the written terms. "Which do you prefer?" he asked. "The ranch room." "Winter travel would waste hours we don't have," she met his eyes. "But I want a month's wages held with Mrs. Ortega. Enough for lodging and a way out if this employment ever ends badly." Done. And courtship doesn't begin just because you made leaving possible. I understand that. He proved it in small ways over the following weeks, leaving the office door open when they worked alone, never once reaching again for what she'd told him she wasn't ready to give. The blue-rimmed bowl found its way back into the kitchen not long after. Pearl broke the last spare one, and Nora finally brought Daniel's bowl down from the box under her bed, where she'd kept it hidden for weeks without quite admitting why. Caleb found her holding it over the wash basin. "Daniel's?" he asked, carefully. "Ours," she said, and it wasn't a correction so much as a small, private decision she'd only just made. She served herself stew in it that night. Not him. Herself. He sat across from her afterward, leaving the chair beside her empty, not from indifference, she understood, but from a kind of patience she hadn't been given much of, in her life, by anyone. Outside, the wind worried at the barn roof long past midnight. Before dawn, 6 weeks ahead of schedule, it began to snow. The first storm lasted 4 days and buried the north grass under a foot of white. Las Animas began feeding hay it hadn't planned to touch until December. Nora cut rations by weight, moved the strongest cattle to the exposed ridges where wind kept the snow thin, and put every hand she could spare on the roofs before the loads grew too heavy. Her system held, until a second storm appeared on the western mesas, a black seam of weather that promised to be worse than the first. Into the middle of it rode a bank agent named Amos Price. The bank would extend Caleb's spring note, but only if Las Animas pledged the breeding herd against it, with the note callable if winter losses climbed past the bank's limit. Price offered one other way out: sell 120 cows immediately to a northern speculator planning to drive them through the snow toward the nearest railhead. The cash would save the ranch. Many of the cattle wouldn't survive the drive. Caleb refused before Nora had finished reading the offer twice. "You didn't ask what I'd recommend," she said, quiet and careful. "I won't sell cattle into a drive that kills them. Then we have to cut mouths somewhere else." She said it as gently as the truth allowed. "There's only one large category left outside the ranch herd, Caleb. Tenant animals. Work stock." His jaw set. Micah promised those families. Micah didn't know this winter was coming. She called the work council that afternoon and laid the arithmetic out plainly. End free feed for private cattle, offer cash wages instead, let each family choose which of their own animals to sell locally. Harsh. Visible. Survivable. Caleb opposed her in front of everyone. Those milk cows keep children fed through the winter. And the ranch cows keep 12 households paid straight through spring. Wade's hand came down hard on the table. Easy for a woman with wages tucked safe in town to tell families to sell their own living. The room went tight and silent. Nora felt the old hunger rise in her throat, sharp as the memory of that last dry heel of bread. I know exactly what an empty room costs, Wade Barlow. I carried it here in a flour sack. It was true, and pain made it crueler than truth needed to be. Your loyalty is what hid the shortage from him, she went on, turning it toward Wade in a way she'd regret before the night was out. If families lose stock now, some part of that loss belongs to you. Enough, Caleb said, standing. Nora turned on him instead. You wanted a manager right up until managing contradicted your grief. And you wanted authority right up until people complicated your sums. Both statements were true. That was exactly what made them so hard to forgive. Caleb ended the meeting without deciding anything at all, and the delay became a decision on its own. That night, Wade quietly opened the reserve stack and issued hay to the tenant pens, recording every forkful honestly, refusing to call it theft even to himself. By morning, 2 full days of emergency reserve were gone. Nora suspended him under the authority Caleb himself had written into the daybook. Caleb reversed her, publicly in the yard in front of the whole crew. Nora unclipped the manager's key from her belt and set it in his open hand. You have the right, she said, and her voice didn't shake, though something underneath it very nearly did. It's your ranch. But I can't carry the responsibility if you take back the authority the moment a choice starts to hurt. And I can't let a ledger be the one to decide which child loses their milk. Then you don't need a manager, Caleb. You need someone whose numbers make your mercy look affordable, and I won't be that for anyone again. She finished her entries in the daybook that same hour, collected the wages owed her through that evening, and rode out on the freight wagon with her notebooks, her empty flour sack, and the blue-rimmed bowl. The ranch stayed behind her under fresh snow, every roof white, every debt exactly where it had been that morning. Nora found work in town within 3 days. It surprised her less than it should have. The merchant hired her to inventory his winter goods and sort out a tangle of credit claims. The wage was smaller than the ranch had paid, but enough to eat, to keep her room with Mrs. Ortega, and to leave her emergency money untouched. Competence, it turned out, traveled with her past Caleb's gate. That steadied her more than pride ever could have. At Las Animas, Caleb learned exactly how much her work had been quietly holding together, simply by trying to do it all himself. Supplies went to the wrong crews. A wagon repair slipped through the cracks. Cattle counts came in a day late, then 2. He could manage any single piece of it. Not all of it at once, not anymore. He didn't ride into town to beg her back. He fixed what was his to fix first. In front of the whole crew, he restored Nora's authority in the daybook, though she wasn't there to see it, and wrote plainly that reversing her suspension in public had made her answer for decisions he'd only ever let her make when they were painless. Wade wasn't dismissed, but he lost sole control over feed movement and agreed to repay the unapproved reserve out of his own wages. Caleb wrote, too, that Micah's promise could no longer stand as a private command laid over living families without their knowledge. Every tenant would be told the real danger and given a vote in what came next. Then he sent Nora copies of it all through Mrs. Ortega. No plea attached. She read every page twice. The second storm closed the road into town not long after. News traveled by horseback instead. Las Animas had lost part of the calving shed roof, and the south herd had broken clean through a drifted fence line. Nora kept counting lamp oil in the merchant's store, hands steady, until Pearl arrived after dark frost whitening her shawl clear through. We don't need you to save Caleb, Pearl said without preamble. We need the plan you taught us to use. Nora wanted to go so badly it frightened her. Has he asked for me? He asked me to carry the roof fastener list. He also said your employment had ended, and you owed the ranch nothing. Pearl set another paper down beside the first. The families voted anyway. 2 will sell their dry cows locally if Las Animas guarantees buyback rights on the spring heifer calves. 1's giving up cash wages to keep the feed instead. Wade's selling his own roan team rather than let the ranch carry the weight of a promise he kept without asking. The decisions were imperfect. They were also finally theirs. Nora rode back with Pearl under a sky just beginning to clear, not as an employee returning, but as a paid winter consultant hired by the Work Council for 10 days, her fee coming from small contributions entered beside every name on the list, Caleb's included. They met in the damaged calving shed, snow still sifting through the broken roof. "I was wrong to reverse you in front of the crew," Caleb said, no preamble in him either. "Wrong to hand you authority I meant to take back the moment grief objected to it. I let you carry the blame and kept the comfort for myself." "I was wrong too," Nora said. "I spoke to Wade like his fear was fraud, and I let hunger convince me that only the choices you can count are the moral ones." "Does that mean you forgive him?" "No, it means a consequence doesn't have to be contempt." They worked apart that whole day, Caleb leading the roof crew, Nora rebuilding the feed schedule with the council, and met again at dusk to find Amos Price back early. The bank's deadline shortened to 48 hours, the speculator's offer still open on the table. This time Caleb didn't answer him alone. He laid the letter in front of the whole council and asked Nora to walk every one of them through what it would actually cost. Changed behavior hadn't solved the choice. It had only handed the choice back to everyone who'd have to live with it. The council turned down the killing drive that left Las Animas short on both cash and hay at once. Nora proposed the harder path: sell 60 sound cows in small local lots, slaughter 12 failing animals for winter beef, cut every wage on the place including Caleb's own, and open a paid feed yard in the sheltered south pens for neighboring ranchers, part of the fee in hay, part in cash. It risked disease. It risked exhausted crews. Careful separation might hold both risks down to something survivable. Wade didn't want outside cattle anywhere near the breeding herd. Pearl didn't want wages cut on families already cold and thin. Caleb didn't want to slaughter cows his own father had chosen by hand years ago, one at a time. Nora didn't much want any of it either. The plan would likely save the ranch, but it would also turn Las Animas, for one hard season, into the kind of place where everyone accepted less so the owner's land could survive. Amos Price complicated the picture further, admitting plainly that the bank preferred the speculator's offer simply because it was easier to close. But the bank also held deposits belonging to the same town's widows and small merchants. If Caleb failed outright, some part of that loss would land on people no less vulnerable than the tenant families upstream. There was no villain in the room clean enough to blame. Caleb asked every household for a private vote on the wage cut and the feed yard, promising no one their job for refusing. 9 accepted. 2 took their final wages and left. 1 asked for a single extra day to decide. "We're losing good people," Caleb told Nora outside the bunkhouse, snow still falling soft and steady. Yes, Micah would have found a way to keep every one of them. Maybe she didn't look away from him. Or maybe you've spent 8 months blaming yourself for failing to become a dead man people only remember at his very best. Caleb closed his eyes against that and didn't argue it. Nora didn't soften the truth for him, but she stayed beside him in the cold while he took the weight of it. The next 30 hours turned into labor instead of argument. Caleb rode to the neighboring spreads and came back with hay payment contracts in hand. Nora divided the south pens and set water times and inspection marks. Wade sold his roan team to the fort and put half toward the reserve. Pearl reorganized every meal around the slaughtered beef. Tomas patched the shed roof with fasteners Nora had ordered weeks before, back when she still had the authority to order anything at all. At midnight, a wind-driven gate failed between the feed yard and the heifer pens. Strange cattle poured toward the breeding stock in the dark, and for one long second Caleb's hand went up to order everyone at once, the way he always had before. He stopped himself. Wade, cattle. Nora, pens. Tell me where. She climbed the fence platform and read the lantern light moving through the dark. West lane open. North closed. Don't chase the red pair. They'll pull the whole herd after them. Caleb obeyed her, even as the red cattle ran straight at his best heifers. Wade curved the mounted crew wide around them. Tomas swung the lane open. Pearl carried lanterns to mark the safe gap between the herds. They separated without a single animal hurt. By dawn, Amos Price looked over the contracts, the votes, the sale receipts, the reduced payroll, and agreed to extend the note on the condition that Caleb pledge the South Hay Meadow lease and accept a smaller line of credit come spring. It meant fewer cattle for at least 3 years and no money left to fix the main house roof. Las Animas would survive. It would survive smaller. Caleb signed. Then he found Nora beside the storeroom, where the brass manager's key still hung on its nail, untouched since the night she'd handed it back. "The council voted to offer you the position permanently," he said. $4 a day through winter, monthly after spring. Authority written out by category. Removal only by me and 2 council members except for cause. A share of the feed yard profits. The room stays yours or you take a place in town, your choice either way. And if I refuse courtship, the offer stands. If I accept the work and later end courtship, the offer stands. She looked at the key a long moment. Then, I accept the work. Hope rose in his face and steadied there, careful, like a man who'd learned not to trust good news too quickly. Nora touched his sleeve. And if the question you didn't finish asking back in October is still there, ask me now. May I court you, Nora Weller? Yes. He didn't kiss her until she lifted her face to him and said the rest of it herself. You may. It was warm and brief, and it didn't save a single cow. That was exactly why she trusted it. By the deepest week of winter, Nora ran the whole of Las Animas, but never once alone. Her authority sat written plain in the daybook: stores, schedules, feed contracts, ordinary purchasing. Wade held cattle movement within agreed limits. Pearl controlled the kitchen and the preserved beef. Tomas kept the water and the wagons running. Caleb kept ownership, debt, land, and final liability, but any decision touching winter rations or wages now required the council's recorded word first. The ranch had lost 60 cows, 12 slaughtered animals, 2 good hands, Wade's roan team, the full spring credit line, and 3 years of the growth Caleb had once counted on. The feed yard earned back enough hay and cash to carry the remaining herd through to March. No child on the place lost their milk. No account pretended even once that mercy came free. The new way of running things was tested before anyone fully trusted it. A neighboring outfit delivered 20 gaunt cows, without mentioning that 3 had been coughing on the drive. The ranch needed the fee badly. Caleb wanted the animals turned away outright. Wade argued a cough after a hard frozen drive proved little, and that refusing the whole lot might cost them every future customer for miles. Months earlier, Caleb would have decided it from the saddle and told the others after the fact. Nora, not long before, might have treated the first uncertain symptom as a number demanding the safest possible answer, full stop. Instead, together they sent Tomas for the local stock tender, kept the newcomers watered apart from the herd, and worked out exactly what one careful day of delay would cost. Caleb told the neighbor the fee would pause during inspection, so Las Animas couldn't profit from holding cattle that weren't cleared. Wade picked 2 riders to watch the animals from outside the breeding pens. The tender found dust irritation, not fever. The cows joined the feed yard the next afternoon. They lost a day's payment and gained something harder to put a number to, proof that shared authority could move slower without being weak. Nora recorded the whole incident anyway. Under decision, she wrote 4 names, not 1. Not everyone admired what the ranch had become. 2 neighboring owners said Las Animas was being run like a town meeting. One former hand claimed Nora had turned hunger into ambition. It was Wade, of all people, who still disagreed with her more often than anyone, who answered that man to his face. She turned counting into a way the rest of us could see a choice coming before we had to pay for it, he said. That's not the same thing as ambition. Nora heard about it, secondhand from Pearl, and never thanked him for it. Instead, she restored his authority to issue emergency feed, up to a written daily limit. Respect between them stayed rough. That, she'd learned, was often what made it reliable. She kept her room behind the wash house and her month's wages held safe with Mrs. Ortega. Courtship crossed the yard by invitation, not assumption. Some evenings Caleb ate with the crew. Some he sat with her in the office door left open. On the Sundays the road allowed it, she went to town alone. Daniel's memory didn't vanish. Neither did Micah's. Nora stopped treating her own anger as the only honest shape grief could take. Caleb stopped obeying his brother's promises blindly and started asking the living people what those promises should actually cost them going forward. In January, he asked her to marry him beside the kitchen table, not in front of the crew, not in the middle of a crisis, just the 2 of them and the lamp burning low. She didn't answer right away. She asked where they'd live, who would own what, whether her position at the ranch would survive the marriage, what would happen if either of them could no longer work. Caleb answered what he could and admitted, plainly, what he couldn't yet know. They agreed the ranch would stay his, property and debt both. Her wages, her profit share, her notebooks, her savings would stay hers. She'd go on as manager, under the same council terms as before. Marriage wouldn't make the work permanent. The work wouldn't make the marriage conditional. People will say I married the owner to keep the keys, she said. People already say I hired a starving widow because I wanted a wife. Did you? No, he looked toward the storeroom, not at her. I hired you because you saw a leak everyone else on this place had learned to just step around. Something in her face eased. And now I love the woman who could leave and argue and earn her own way clean out from under me, and still chooses the chair next to mine anyway. She said yes. But she set the wedding for spring, after the note's first payment cleared, and after winter stopped being the only practical reason she had to stay. That night, Pearl served stew in whatever bowls were left standing. Nora took Daniel's blue-rimmed bowl down from the shelf one more time. The enamel was chipped clean through in one spot now. It had endured anyway. Caleb reached for a different bowl out of habit. This one has room, Nora said. She didn't hand it to him. She set a second chair beside her own instead, and split the fresh bread between two plates, and opened the winter ledger to tomorrow's work while the stew was still warm. Outside, cattle moved quietly behind the windbreak. The storeroom key lay on the table between her hand and his, not a token of love and never meant to be one. It stayed exactly what it always should have been, a tool entrusted for work. The empty flour sack she'd carried to Las Animas that first morning hung beside it now, patched at the corner and filled with seed grain for Pearl's spring garden. Whether Caleb had been right to risk the breeding herd to protect the tenant family's milk cows, or whether Nora's harder plan should have governed from the very start, was a question the winter never answered for either of them. But when Nora read the morning's assignments aloud the next day, Caleb listened along with everyone else at the table. Was Caleb right to risk the breeding herd to protect the tenant family's milk cows, or should Nora's stricter plan have governed from the start? If this story stayed with you, tell us in the comments which choice you believe real stewardship required.